My name is Holning Lau. I teach not too far away at UNC, the School of Law there, and it is my honor to moderate the next plenary panel. I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers of this conference. It's been such an amazing day already. So many of the topics that we're discussing are extremely depressing, but being surrounded by all of you here, hearing about the work that everyone's doing, hearing about everyone's ideas has really instilled in me a sense of hope. So thank you to the conference organizers for bringing us together. All right. The topic of our plenary panel is developments and ongoing challenges for LGBTQ communities, and we have an awesome panel of speakers to address this issue, and I'll introduce them now without any further ado. In alphabetical order, we have Bernadette Brown. Maybe you could wave hi, Bernadette. Bernadette is director of the Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity here at Duke. She was born and raised in Detroit and began her career as a public defender in New York City. In 2009, she was selected as a fellow for the inaugural cohort of the Pipeline Project's 21st Century Fellows Program, a national program designated to promote and support LGBT leaders of color. Prior to joining Duke in 2015, she worked on LGBTQI issues in a few different capacities, including leadership roles at the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, at the National Prison Rape Elimination Act Resource Center, and at Michigan's statewide LGBT rights organization. Bernadette received her BA from Columbia University and her JD from Boston University. And when she's not busy trying to find justice, Bernadette loves spending time with her teen son and finding restaurants with tasty gluten-free menus. All right, next we have Chinyere Ezie. Hi, Chinyere. Chinyere Ezie is a staff attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center LGBT Rights Project, where she is lead counsel for Ashley Diamond, a transgender woman whose lawsuit challenging Georgia's practice of denying transgender inmates safekeeping and medical care has received backing from the U.S. Department of Justice. Prior to joining the Southern Poverty Law Center, Chinyere clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and worked as an associate at the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen in Hamilton. Chinyere is a Fulbright Scholar, a graduate of Yale University and Columbia Law School, where she served as editor-in-chief of the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law. In her free time, Chinyere enjoys studying foreign languages, spending time with her wife, and their little puppy named Montgomery. All right, I'm going to be introducing the next two speakers jointly. We have Juan and G. Sessions-Smalls.
Hi.
Juan and G. Sessions-Smalls are the co-founders of the Gentlemen's Foundation Incorporated, a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the empowerment and healthy development of LGBTQ men of color through holistic mentorship, proactive dialogue, and encouraging public service, leadership, networking among its members. This award-winning couple can be seen doling out love, life, and relationship advice on their blog, Love Works, and at conferences like this around the country. They also entertain audiences via their newest platform, Juan and G Live, a talk show-style event that aims to enlighten, enrich, and entertain. Juan and G have been married almost as long as they've known each other. The two reside in Atlanta with their son, Little G, and Lady, their spunky Jack Russell Terrier. All right. And finally, last but not least, we have Holiday Simmons. Holiday Simmons holds a master's degree in social work and is the director of community education and advocacy for Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest national legal organization committed to achieving full recognition of the civil rights of LGBT people and people with HIV. In addition to having a background in social work, Holiday also has extensive experience in education, the performing arts, and activism. He is a Black Cherokee transmasculine two-spirit activist, athlete, and lover of babies, soccer, and the ocean. Welcome. All right, I'm going to start this panel by asking each of you to take 2 minutes to let the audience know when you heard about our panel topic for today, developments and ongoing challenges for LGBT communities, what did that bring to mind? What did it make you want to talk about? What made you think, hey, this is something that I want to come here and discuss? So 2 minutes to start us off. Maybe we'll start with Holiday and move down the road.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Holning, for moderating this panel discussion, to my esteemed panelists, and for Duke for having us. First of all, I want to acknowledge that today is Trans Day of Remembrance, and we are around the country, around the world, actually honoring transgender lives that have been taken too soon. So I want to acknowledge that, which is a great segue for developments and challenges. So I think some of the developments in LGBTQ movements are legal and policy gains. Obviously, the recent Supreme Court ruling around marriage is, I wouldn't say it's a setback. I hesitate to put it in the category of sort of like groundbreaking. We knew eventually it would happen. Other nations have done it for longer than us. But it's definitely a development. We also see other legal and policy gains around non-discrimination policies, city ordinances that are having non-discrimination policies, as well as like workplace rights. Heightened visibility in the media around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, and even around HIV criminalization. But the challenges are definitely are reign high. There's a long list of challenges. And the first one is that we're still operating under a system of sexual orientation first, gender identity last, sort of trickle-down model. We're still operating under representation politics versus reparation politics. And what I mean is pointing to a few people in media like Janet Mock or Laverne Cox or now Caitlyn Jenner in terms of the trans spectrum, and then all of the media and shows that have gay characters and LGBT characters. There's a lot of more media representation, but then there's this politic, what I call like the Oprah syndrome or the Obama syndrome, or now we could even say the Caitlyn syndrome, which is, having representation, but that not necessarily trickling down to the masses as feeling more safe or having more rights. And so that's good that there's more visibility and representation, but this cannot be confused with the masses of people having more access and more safety. And finally, I think a challenge is our work is still not intersectional enough. We saw this definitely with the overturn of DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, that happened at the same time. So that was good that DOMA was overturned, but at the same time we saw a drastic going backwards in time in terms of the Voting Rights Act around the same time. So our movements have gained a lot, for sure. There's a conversation around LGBTQ lives in people's homes. There's language we can use instead of just saying they are that way, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. Bernadette?
Thank you, Holning. And the center, by the way, has a very nice display across in the Bryan Center for those of you who want to go for Transgender Day of Remembrance. And we had a luncheon earlier today, so I've been well fed and with gluten-free stuff. And this should go well. So when I heard about this, it was Seth Pearson, who is president of Outlaw here at Duke. Raise your hand, Seth, so everyone knows. And Seth said, Bernadette, come speak on this panel. And that was that. But the first thing I thought about is basically my career before I came to Duke, which, as Holning pointed out, I started out as a public defender in New York City and then later worked on criminal and juvenile justice issues around LGBTQI folks in those systems, as well as the military. So my concern is not a development, but it is the ongoing profiling and criminalization of LGBTQI folks in this country. And probably not I as an intersex, because we don't really have much data for that, but definitely around LGBTQ folks and why that's happened, after Stonewall. And what a lot of people don't seem to understand is that everything supposedly started with Stonewall, but in the decade preceding Stonewall, there were a number of uprisings against police officers and law enforcement throughout the country, and especially in the South. We never hear about that. We've heard about Compton, cafeteria riots in California, and then obviously Stonewall. But there was a buildup to all of that happening. And so what concerns me is that the very issue that galvanized a movement, that indeed created a movement, was completely dropped off and has not been really talked about since. So that's one of the things that concerns me, and I hope that we get to talk a little bit more about that today and just the overwhelming disproportionality of LGBTQ folks who are in the criminal and juvenile justice systems in this country.
Good afternoon. When I saw the title of this panel and then in the context of the conference as a whole, what immediately jumped out to me was, how are we going to talk about LGBTQ rights as a civil rights discussion when I've been taught all my life that civil rights equal black rights? And the black community is not very welcoming to the LGBTQ community. So I wanted to really explore on the panel, how can we begin to change that narrative? How can we begin to have the black community as a whole fully embrace their gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender and queer brothers and sisters? And the first thing that popped out into my head was it's an issue of self-awareness. It's an identity issue. I think we need to look at where we as black people first, because I believe I'm a black man first, we are deeply rooted in holding on to our pain. We want to nourish it, hold it close to our bosom. The civil rights movement was ours. It's a black movement. No one else can share in that pain. And I think once we begin to let go of that narrative, we can begin to fully embrace everyone, on the same playing field, on the same plane. So I would like to discuss, that a little bit more.
When I first heard of the name of the panel, some of the common things that, everybody are pretty much aware of our community, HIV, marriage equality, and so forth. But I think the biggest challenge that we have as a community is love, lack thereof for ourselves and for other people, which prevents us from having healthy relationships with ourselves and other people. Growing up as young LGBTQ boys and girls, we grow up in rejection from everybody else, rejection of ourselves. And, hopefully we all get to a point where we are accepting of ourselves, but you still have, 18 plus years of rejection to get over. And I feel like that causes a lot of depression, a lot of insecurities, suicide amongst our community, and unhealthy relationships. And I think it's the root of all of the other challenges that we have going on within the community. So I think it starts and ends there. Love.
And thanks again to the organizers for convening this panel. I think, like many of the presenters, I began today with a reflection about this panel's presence at a conference like this. And I'm grateful that this space was created at a civil rights conference to talk about LGBT issues. I do think it's fortuitous, and I think it's timely. Ultimately, for me, there are a number of reasons why LGBT issues should be thought of as civil rights issues, beginning with the fact that whether you're looking at an issue such as mass incarceration, over-policing, immigrant justice, racial justice, you're looking at people who, issues where LGBT folks stand part of your membership. They stand part of the affected community. And to deny that is to literally cut many people in two. Second, I think, attending this panel, I reflect on the words of MLK, words that he wrote in 1963 when he was imprisoned in Birmingham. I'm just a little ways away in Montgomery these days. And he spoke about the interrelatedness of communities and states. And he admonished all of us to think about injustice anywhere as a threat to justice everywhere. And I think that type of philosophy is really crucial when understanding LGBT rights issues in the appropriate frame. And I also think it offers intersectionality as a praxis that can be an organizing principle and a movement strategy when it comes to thinking about oppressions in this country. And frankly, I believe it is probably the greatest chance we have to securing our collective freedom as racial minorities, as sexual minorities, as immigrants, people seeking to have a place within our nation state.
Thanks. I think just these opening statements underscore that we have a lot to talk about. Let me start with a few of you mentioned marriage equality. Right. So now that we do have the Obergefell decision, we have marriage equality. Do any of you care to speak about what do you think are the one or two biggest lessons learned from the marriage equality movement? Thoughts?
Don't mess with the gays. No, I seriously, I think that, one of the greatest lessons is that, we stand together, we can really influence change. I think that was one of the greatest lessons, at least for me.
I think I kept, thankfully, throughout the whole fight for marriage equality, when it was a state-by-state fight, and in the state of Georgia, at one point it was a sort of a county-by-county fight. Before the Obergefell decision, the state of Georgia, which maybe is not a surprise, we had a constitutional amendment, like a lot of states did. However, in Fulton and DeKalb counties, which is much of the city of Atlanta, there was a lot of civil rights for LGBT families. So even if you didn't have marriage equality, you can sort of piecemeal protections for your family. And I tried to look at the marriage equality movement as a set of lessons and ways to protect families, and not necessarily sort of a single issue that was excluding a lot of people, as people know, and as a critique of the marriage equality movement is that it excludes a lot of people. But it is a set of lessons, and I think that we can take those lessons in terms of it had a multi-pronged messaging. So in the courtrooms, the message was, this is unconstitutional. And there was nothing about morals, it was nothing about love is love, it was just straight up, this is unconstitutional. References to Loving versus Virginia were very helpful and useful. But in the media and in social norms, that the pulling of the heartstrings and the moral sort of compass was exactly what I think helped win over certain hearts and minds. And so you saw media campaigns that said, love wins, love is love, love has no color, what is, I couldn't change even if I could, so there's even a song, So that's helpful for people's hearts and minds, not so much for judges, right? And then in social justice and political thought spheres, I think the marriage equality movement had a message of making it, which I actually critiqued the message, but I also think it was effective, of saying this is the next civil rights movement. Now I have a whole list from here to Texas of critiques about that. However, I do think for the sort of the average meat and potatoes American who's not thinking about anything beyond their own identities, if they're a straight person and a cisgender person, saying the civil rights movement, that statement in and of itself has credit, has credence, it has teeth. And so to say, oh, hey, this is the next civil rights movement, I think that actually helped win over certain judges and certain hearts and minds, even though we know that oppression politics is very dangerous, and I do not think it was the next civil rights movement. But I do think that rhetoric that existed in political spaces was effective.
And I would acknowledge that I have a pretty complicated relationship with the issue of marriage equality. I often call myself a marriage-free writer because I recently did get married to my longtime partner, but I've had a pretty staunch position that that's not what I want to be devoting my time as a lawyer to working on, and that I frankly think we devoted as a LGBT community far too many resources, attorney and otherwise, to litigating this issue. Not to say that it wasn't to, ultimately great benefit to many, but I think that there are some lessons that I took away from the marriage equality movement that I think are worthy of conveying. One is, it really did demonstrate for me the capacity of others, whether that was having a fairly significant Nigerian attendance at my gay marriage earlier this summer, whether it was seeing the NAACP Legal Defense Fund submit an amicus brief in the various cases that went before the Supreme Court, where they, with obvious credibility, argued that the issue of marriage equality should be viewed as, a civil rights issue, that Loving v. Virginia should be a relevant precedent that obtained. I think that we often sell other communities short and other movements short when it comes to their willingness to back LGBT-related issues. If anything, I would turn that lens within the LGBT community and say, what are you doing, to support racial justice movements? What are you doing to support immigrant justice movements? Because I think the marriage equality movement did provide some evidence that there are groups that are flying other banners that are still willing to support LGBT issues when called upon. But I think there was also an uncomfortable lesson, which is the power of assimilationist narratives. We relied on them in our messaging. We tried to convey, we're just like you guys. We have families. We're normal. There was a real sort of normative thrust to a lot of the arguments that sort of got us to where we are. And I think that, frankly, they make me uncomfortable. I don't think respectability should be the lens through which we access rights. And I think, nonetheless, they did prove to be very powerful and very persuasive to many.
Any other comments on this particular question?
But specifically as it relates to marriage equality, we've been married for 6 years, and it was in the work that we do and the people we come in contact with, it kind of was expected that we stood up for marriage equality, that we were out on the front lines, that we were speaking at City Hall, and we didn't do any of that because that wasn't, and I'll speak for myself, that wasn't an issue that was as important as other things that we were doing in our work. And kind of got some heat from some people saying, oh, you preach this love yourself, love everybody else, love works, all of that, yet you aren't backing that up on the marriage equality stand. And I think the biggest lesson for me, just through that entire time period, is that we as a community need to understand that everyone isn't fighting the same fight. And we need to realize and respect that everyone doesn't have the same ideals. While we may be working towards the same collective goal, we need people on all fronts. So if everyone rushes, like you just said, if everyone rushes to the marriage equality front, then where does that leave our youth? Where does that leave transgendered people? Where does that leave people who are depressed or on the brink of suicide? So we need to be true to ourselves, and that was the biggest lesson I took from it, is to not succumb to the pressures of society or family or friends and tell you how to do your work. Absolutely. I just stood on the sidelines, and kind of would just watch and kind of build my courage and self-awareness and self-esteem in standing my ground and knowing that I'm doing the best work that I have to do, and I don't have to shift just because society is telling me to do so. So it was more of a personal lesson than anything.
So I think a lot of these comments do force us to grapple with intersectionality. So I'd like to follow up with a few questions, and you could feel free to answer whichever one you want. One is a broad one. What role would you like to see intersectionality play? How do we implement an intersectional approach to advocacy and intersectional politics? And more specifically, Holiday's point, when confronted with this claim that LGBT rights are the new civil rights issue of the day, how do you confront that? How do you discuss that with folks on the ground? Another related question is this: how has the Black Lives Matter movement, which is queer-led, impacted conversations about the intersection of LGBT civil rights and racial justice?
Well, I think one way that the Black Lives Matter movement has started conversations is the fact that it is queer-led. And a lot of times, unfortunately, LGBTQ people in the Black community are not accepted or recognized as such. And so the fact that we are on the front lines leading this movement, I think it starts the conversation of inclusion, accepting that we are a part of the bigger fight, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. And I definitely think healthy conversations are happening.
And I think when I spoke earlier of intersectionality as a praxis, I think what I'm referring to is this idea that, to a large scale, people who are committed to social justice in some form or another come to understand that oppressions have overlapping qualities, and that, when you speak about an immigration detention center and sort of the social harms that causes, if you add the lens of what it means to be, someone who perhaps has a liminal status, as I spoke about earlier, who also, for instance, is transgender, and how that reshapes the experiences that one has in an immigration detention facility or otherwise. I just think it's important that we sort of come to see all of our oppressions as relevant to sort of increasing our understanding of the faces of injustice, and also relevant to really coming up with something comprehensive, a vision for a society that we can live with. It really has to be inclusive of all of our identities. And, advancing a racial justice movement that imagines a Black community that doesn't have LGBT people in it is obviously missing a crucial element, as is, in my view, again, a criticism that I do level at my community all the time, an LGBT rights movement that doesn't visualize people of color as part of that, part of their membership.
Go ahead.
I have, because I run the Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity here at Duke, so there are always students around, and I have to say that every time we get together in discussion groups or we have workshops and so on, I really have to push back on the perpetuating of this trope about Blacks and Latinos being particularly anti-LGBT. I think this has done so much damage. And as I tell the students and anywhere else I go, you are the expert of your experience, so speak from your experience. But this constant throwing under the bus of Black, straight, and cisgender people has really got to stop. I'm a Black lesbian. I grew up in Detroit. All my Black family loves me. All my Black friends love me. I know plenty of Black people who don't have horror stories, and that's not the story that we ever hear in the media, and there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. And that is really, really problematic. I never hear a white lesbian whose parents kicked her out of the house follow that story up and say, well, you know how the white community is. Right. When in fact, research shows that white people, just because there are more white people, right, are more anti-LGBT. Right. So, I mean, we've had research for decades showing Black straight folks supporting employment protections, housing protections, health care, a whole range of things, and we never hear that. You have to go and find it and look for it, but we never hear that. All we want to hear is that, straight Black people are horrible and, don't accept us. So that's one important factor to intersectionality, is the recognition. And I'll give you an example of how harmful this is. As I said before, I came here, I worked in juvenile justice reform, and I worked with a lot of social workers. And it was amazing to me how many social workers, if a white parent said something negative about their gay child, there was more work about, let's see how we can support this parent and what can we do for this family. They treated it like an addiction, like alcoholism or something else that you could perhaps get the family some supportive resources, and then maybe they can be less rejecting, which research does indicate will be better off for the child. You don't have to be supportive. You don't have to go to the pride parade. You don't have to hang out a rainbow flag. You don't have to do any of those things. Don't call your child a fag. And guess what? Your child's likelihood of trying to commit suicide decreases, right? So those are really important things to talk about. But when they would meet with Black or Latino families, immediately, this family is homophobic, this child can't be there, we've got to take this child out. And so this has very, very real consequences. And it's much more nuanced than that. I know, is Catherine Smith here right now? Catherine Smith is a professor. Catherine Smith? Do you remember I talked to you on the phone? So I'm gonna nerd out for like 30 seconds because I quote Professor Catherine Smith all the time, her article, Queer as Black Folk. And we had this conversation. If you all haven't read Queer as Black Folk, you should really read this article. See, and I just give you tons of props, too. But she wrote this article, and in the intro to the article, she describes this conversation with her father, where she comes out to him, and she describes him as this Black man from the South. And his response to her is, "I'd rather you be a whore than you be gay." So clap your hands if that's a loving parental response. You all think that's affirming. That's like what we'd like to see, right. But then Catherine goes on to say that her father said, essentially, because now you will be stereotyped as a sexual threat to white women. So you see, it was much more nuanced than that. And that is what it demonstrates two things. And so Catherine's article is really is about using the same as argument, right, with the civil rights movement and some other things. But and then she talked about saying same as and similar to. And so when I read the article and I emailed her, I said, because she didn't agree with her father, right? You didn't agree. And I was like, your father is actually right. And you're not, you're wrong, Professor Smith. And she goes, what do you mean? And what I tried to explain is, this issue around not just sexual orientation, but what Holiday was getting at, gender conformity and gender nonconforming. Gender nonconforming Black girls who are also gay, as I have seen in the system, are much more likely to be viewed as predatory and aggressive and threatening the same way we view Black boys and men. They are not Black boys or men, but they can be viewed that way. And this has a lot of consequences. It has consequences for them getting kicked out of school. It has consequences for how they're profiled by law enforcement. And if they are in detention, it has consequences to their treatment and their education while they are in detention. So this is a very serious issue. And so when I talk to many of these Black parents, detention centers will call me in and say, talk to these parents. The parents are anti-gay or the mother is anti-gay and they're Black and and I'm like, no, I don't know. What are you trying to say? Because you just said they're Black. That's all I know is that they're just Black. So, and so it would go a little bit deeper into similar what Professor Smith's dad said. It's the worry, it's the fear that I don't want my child to be targeted for one more thing.
But how often is that communicated to the child?
Hang on one second. So it isn't often communicated very well, but for professionals who work in this field, who also go out and tell this narrative, it is their job to learn how to facilitate those conversations and understand those nuances before you rip children out of their homes. And that is a broader issue around intersectionality, is looking at all of those things. So, and it's the same thing with Latinas who are gender nonconforming and who have tattoos and live in certain neighborhoods are more likely to be profiled as gang members. This has very real consequences on the lives of people, which we're not paying to. And as Chinyere pointed out, when you look at the LGBT leaders, how many of you see Black people? If you just start thinking of LGBT leaders, I'm not talking about actors on TV, but you can look at them too. We don't have very many. We don't see ourselves, and I've said this for years, since I became a professional lesbian. The experience, do you all know what a professional lesbian is?
Gay for pay?
Not gay for pay. That is a whole nother, that's a whole nother panel, and that's on the cable network. No, it means I actually am gay, and then I get paid to do LGBT advocacy. It's very different from gay for pay. But no, I've encountered a lot more racism from working within this movement than I have outside of it. And people are really, really surprised by that, because that's the dirty little secret in the LGBT movement. You want to stand up on television next to Benjamin Jealous or Congressman John Lewis as a white gay man and say, support marriage, but that white gay man won't hire any Black people in senior management positions in his organization. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The gall, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the gall. And then you get upset when people say you can't say civil rights as a phrase, or use the capital C, the capital R, or the lowercase, or what have you. So all of these things come together, and this is what intersectionality is for me.
Juan, did you have a response?
Well, I have a question. No, my question really is, how often do the parents really expand on that narrative when they just kick their child out or they just called them a fag? How many of them really follow that up with, I'm calling you a faggot because I'm scared that white people won't accept you, or I'm scared that you're going to go out into the world and people are going to throw stones at you? Rarely in my experience that happens, so in your work, I'm curious to know, are those conversations being had, or are these children going out into this world feeling like their entire family has turned their back on them, has abandoned them, and they have nowhere to go?
Well, not all of them have been kicked out. First of all, that was just one. But that's a mental health thing, right? Most of these families are in crisis. So not even white families are saying that. No one is saying, I am doing this because. That's a level of human communication and enlightenment that most human beings just haven't even reached. Not even the ones who are not in crisis. That's a communication issue. Mm-hmm. That this is why I'm acting out this way. But it doesn't mean this. Now, the impact is real. The impact is real either way. But it doesn't help for us to continue with the narrative, because what happens is people don't want to provide resources. There was one county I worked with that was predominantly Latino, and they said, well, we have an LGBT center, and this LGBT center was predominantly white. And we said to them, you risk re-traumatizing kids of color when you send them to LGBT centers, most of which many of which are racist and cannot provide services for youth of color. And what you need to do is reach out to the organizations that you already work with that provide services to youth of color because they have the experience, and ask them if they want to include LGBTQ programming. And so many counties were shocked when they did that because so many of those programs were faith-based and they were held at churches or supported by churches. Hardly any of those faith-based programs said no. And these were all Black and Latino communities. But they never bothered to ask. Instead, they were sending, kids, to the suburbs, to these centers that had no programming for youth of color, which was damaging. Because then what happens is they don't go. You've made it a part of their probation terms. They don't go. They violate probation. And where are they? They're back in detention. So it just makes no sense.
I wanted to respond to that. Yeah, I definitely, colonization is and was a very powerful, cunning tool. And why I'm saying that is that I agree with most all of your points in terms of there is a racism involved in this narrative of communities of color are more homophobic and are more transphobic. And the irony is, there's two ironic parts. One is that the household name for anti-LGBT violence is Matthew Shepard. Like, if you think of that, most people, if people say, if you ask the average person, who is someone who was assaulted or killed because of their orientation, most people can think of this name, Matthew Shepard. It's the name that backs our hate crimes laws now, right? But no one says, the white people in Laramie, what is it, Montana? Wyoming, thank you. I knew it was that part of the country. North Dakota, South Dakota. No one. So this is the poster child for hate and also I have critiques of the hate crimes bill, but that's another panel. But if the poster child for the hate crimes bill as it relates to sexual orientation, not the James Byrd part around the racism part, but the sexual orientation part, is a white boy but the narrative is not, it's whiteness or white America that's homophobic, and that's why we need this hate crimes law. However, we will say that Jamaican communities and Nigerian communities and African American communities are more racist. And I definitely think that's a form of colonization. Now, the second ironic piece is around colonization. Many of our cultures, most all, but only many are documented, not all of them, have a history of third genders, two-spirit, mahu, whatever you want to call it. And so before colonization, when Europeans came and saw these gender fluidity among gender binary people, that was sort of like one of the first forms of fear and one of the first sort of not even a backlash. Colonization is itself a backlash. So the first examples of getting rid of people's culture. So get rid of their language, get rid of their religion, get rid of these gender, queer, two-spirit, whatever we call it now. So many of our culture. I just named a few of them. In Turtle Island, North America, we call North America. We call us two-spirits. In Hawaii, they're called mahu, and gatekeepers in West Africa. So. The irony of thinking that communities of color are more homophobic and transphobic is that we are the ones that have histories of having gender fluid people that were actually revered, that were actually healers, that were the precursor to social workers, the precursors to what we call, orphanages. These are the folks that would take children after parents passed away. These are the folks that, because they can navigate between seemingly opposing identities, men, women, elders, children, and two-spirit people can navigate in both. I'm Black Cherokee, by the way, and I do a lot of work with two-spirit and LGBT Native Americans, and it's not just Native Americans that have this history. We have, yes, that particular culture has a lot of documented history, but many cultures of color, from Asia to the Americas, have these third gender warriors that were lost distinctly during colonization. So the irony that these are the communities that are more homophobic and transphobic is a part of that very functional machine called colonization.
I'd like to invite the panelists to expand the discussion now to cover additional fault lines that we haven't talked as much about. So you reference the line between LGB and T, right? And how the movement prioritizes LGB as opposed to T, or LG, or G perhaps. How does class, complicate our conversation? How does geography perhaps complicate our conversation? Chinyere and we've talked a little bit about how being here in the American South, right, creates a special dynamic. So I welcome thoughts on these additional fault lines.
Something that I've been studying a lot in my legal work of late is sort of both the way discrimination manifests itself in the South and sort of the way LGBT communities have to form in order to be particularly resilient to the challenges that exist here, as well as sort of the particular experiences of transgender people in the South and elsewhere, transgender people of color, and sort of how these stories and experiences really aren't being reflected in some of the more dominant discussions about sexual orientation liberation. One client that I've had the privilege of working with now for about a year and a half is named Ashley Diamond. She's a transgender woman who was born and raised in Rome, Georgia, poor, and in a community that is white, racist, and racist towards people of all different types of genders and identities. But in her case, being Black and transgender, she had a very difficult time coming up. She, like many people in this country, but again, not reflected in the dominant narratives when we talk about, what is the new civil rights movement or what is pressing when it comes to the LGBT community. She was subject to a lot of policing based on being trans, walking down the street, being pulled over by cops because if you're, a transgender woman, then, I guess you're a sex worker. I guess you're, engaged in some sort of criminal activity. And, this is, by the way, policing that we're effectively tolerating across the country. There's a recent case of a woman who checked into a hotel only to be arrested on suspicion that she was a sex worker. In fact, she was going to a funeral, and was then incarcerated for 8 days because she had undocumented prescription medication. What was that? Her hormone treatment. So again, but where are the headlines about these stories? In any event, Ashley Diamond would apply to work, would apply to jobs, Walmart, McDonald's, what have you. Every time she gets, tries to get a job, once it's uncovered that she's transgender, that her gender identity is different than her sex assigned at birth, quickly fired. And so we had a case, and it's again continues to be pretty predominant in our society, of discrimination being very targeted, being very tolerated against transgender people because of their perceived difference, because of which bathroom are they going to use, because of the disgust that we, again, frankly, tolerate to some degree when it comes to sort of non-normativity around gender. Fast forward, police discriminated against, over-policed, incarcerated because to survive, apart from diving into dumpsters and eating, scraps there, Ashley began to steal. And so, I became involved when, 3 years into her incarceration in Georgia Department of Corrections on a 12-year sentence for theft, for violating probation on an offense of pawing I think it was a leaf blower, something to that effect. Because again, this is how we value Black bodies, non-normative bodies in this country. That the prisons apparently are the safest, most appropriate places for people who society neglects. I get involved because Ashley is being subjected to a system of state-sanctioned violence, of being raped repeatedly, of having prison guards say, well, you must have invited it because you're transgender, or what do you expect? You look like the way you do. Being denied medical care, being told, that in spite of the fact that she had received hormone therapy for 17 years, it was irrelevant and that, she's going to be safer anyway if she's perceived as a man. Why don't you butch up? Why don't you man up? Why are you sissies running around like that? So, we have a real system in this country. I term it often the discrimination to incarceration pipeline that is affecting people of color, transgender people of color, people who are non-normative at really alarming rates. Transgender people are very overrepresented in the system of mass incarceration, which is once again why I think, or just a reason why I think that we need to think about racial justice struggles and LGBT struggles as actually having substantial areas of overlap. Certainly within immigration detention, you see a very large percentage of transgender people relative, again, to their population. And And one reason for that is that you see a lot of people from Latin America and other places trying to, not necessarily because the United States is their vision of a panacea, but because the intolerance for gender identities can cross borders. They're coming, imagining that this is a place where they can sort of be their authentic selves, and instead we're putting them in, again, incarcerated settings where effectively we're subjecting them to state-sanctioned torture and state-tolerated torture. And so I really do think that we need to expand the conversation, as we're doing today, to think about issues other than marriage equality, other than formal equality, other than assimilation 2.0 is sort of what's affecting the LGBT community.
Anyone else? Holiday?
What's the question again?
Follow up on the same line.
Well, in your opening comments, you mentioned how T issues are have sometimes not been prioritized by the mainstream LGBT movement. And so going forward, how do we make sure to incorporate those T issues, elevate them, and then also all these other issues that we're talking about that intersect with race and class, and how do we implement that?
So I have a couple of responses. One is that my narrative to other trans people, well, I think everyone, but definitely when I'm talking to other trans people, is not one of inclusion. Certainly, we want to stop being, targeted on the street by other people as well as law enforcement. Certainly, we want to be less targeted in terms of discrimination on the workplace. However, I really feel like I need the narrative to shift from inclusion to we are anointed. We have something to teach cisgender people. Everybody familiar with the term cisgender? I keep thinking everyone, is, and I keep meeting people who are not. It just means if you're not trans, you agree with your assigned sex at birth. And so I keep feeling like this is not about us being like them. I don't like the narrative of we're all the same for lots of things. I definitely don't like it when we're talking about racial justice. I do not feel like we're the same. Some of us have histories that make us in sync with the cosmos and our ancestors and our babies. Some of us do not, and so we're not the same. And certainly around gender, I don't want to be the same as cisgender people, and I think actually it should be subverted, and cis people have lots to learn from trans people. To live one lifetime in multiple genders is a great gift. It is a great gift. There are so many lessons to be taught, and even anecdotally from being able to navigate a spa and a barbershop the same day, the same year, but more seriously also around, being able to, what resilience does it take to keep yourself safe while just trying to go to the doctor, while just trying to apply to a job? What does that take? What are all the methods you use to keep yourself safe? There's a lot to be taught there. So in terms of the T following the LGB, that does happen, and I'm not saying that I want exclusion to continue to happen, but I do want the narrative around that to change. And all that leads to my thoughts around one of the questions I think we're going to hit, although I don't think we'll have time, is around allyship and what does it mean to be an ally. And I think that ally work is actually as much, if not more, about self-work and intra-group work as it is external work. So I think a lot of times when people are like, oh my God, I have this privilege, I have to go and be with the people who are disenfranchised so they can know that I know that,
I love them.
And I have all this money, let me go live in the hood. That does not help people in the hood. So I think the work actually has to be about what does it mean to be normalized and to be centralized? What have I given up to have this privilege? And what am I missing? And also sort of questions around who else is in this group, and what are the mechanisms to push people out of this group and to go in and out of this group, the group meaning the privileged group and whatever it is we're talking about. So in the LGB versus T, conversation or white versus people of color conversation, able-bodied versus disabled conversation, whatever your privilege is, what does that mean? Focus a little bit less on like, oh, the marginalized people all the way over there. What is that like? Come join us. No, how did you get to that central place? What did you give up to get to that central place? And then once you have done enough of the work and I'm gonna just, anecdotally say you're in. In other words, some people, they're such a, you feel they've done so much work. They're on the arc of being an ally so much that you almost forget that they're an ally. Like the straight people that you forget aren't queer, and what have you. Be like, oh, they're not trans. Oh my God. Once you're in, so to speak, which is, and it's, of course, it's just knowing when to move up and when to move back. But also those of us with like multiple identities that are more marginalized to remember that we all also have privileges, and to, as much as you're pointing the proverbial finger, constantly doing the work on the three that are pointing back at you, and that will ultimately make the whole circle of privileges and oppressions more robust. And I think that's the root of. I was in a workshop earlier, right before this, where they were talking about wondering if there was a question around if black men or black folks were less sexist and less otherist, and there was a little bit, I think, in the audience confusion, like, wow, I'm surprised that people who have felt one oppression aren't not necessarily aligning themselves with other oppressions. It doesn't work that way. It certainly really doesn't work that way. And so the flip side of that is, if you do have whatever your oppressions are, especially if they're, there's a multitude of them, is to constantly working on also your privileges. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'd like to comment on what Holiday just said about the trans anointing. I think it's important for straight people or cisgender people to also realize that within the G, there's a lot of ignorance as it relates to trans lives. And it's rooted in probably the same issues that straight people have. We just don't understand. So I love that you said the anointing, because there's a lot that we can learn. I have conversations with friends and colleagues all the time and say, well, you have a trans woman here who dates women. So is she a lesbian, or is she like what? It's just trying to wrap your head around all of these unknowns. And so I think the important thing to realize is that it's okay to not know. It's okay to ask questions in the polite way. So I love that you said anointing, because just in the last few weeks, I feel like I've learned so much just researching, even as a gay man who I'm supposed to, be all accepting and knowing because I want people to accept me, right? No, I have to really learn and find out and dig deeper and ask questions and investigate, because it doesn't all make sense in my brain, and that's okay, And I really, really, really appreciate the what I've learned, because it taught me more about myself. It teaches me, it continues to, and I think once people begin to just navigate what's unknown to them, move past the fear, and kind of just place yourself on that same vein, I always throw it back to myself. How would I feel if that were me? And it's very easy to put yourself in that space if you really want to learn and to change and to accept.
And I think I just have one, hopefully, brief response to that. I think that, while I agree that having a minoritized identity doesn't give you an automatic insight into sort of other types of oppressions, and at the very least, it's dangerous to assume, for instance, as a white gay man, you're just with it. You know what oppression looks like. You've smoked it out of all its corners and caves. I do think that there is a lot of data that shows that being sort of capable of the empathy that I think kind of comes with having and occupying multiple minoritized identities, sort of what I associate with Professor Sudner's project of love, just sort of understanding that oppression takes multiple forms, and they get really heavy when they're all on your back at once. I do think that we see, if you look at organizations across the country, you see queer people of color, LGBT people of color, occupying positions of leadership in environmental justice organizations, in racial justice organizations. As we spoke earlier, the organizers of Black Lives Matter are queer, brown women, and I think that those are lessons to be learned about what intersectionality looks like when it's an intentional process, when it's an application of sort of ideas and principles to a social problem. I do think it allows us to tap into our capacity to show empathy.
Bernadette, did you?
Because one of the things you mentioned is what do we do about this? So I wanted to follow up on what Chinyere was talking about in the beginning with Ashley. And so, one of the things that the government tried to do was pass the Prison Rape Elimination Act in 2003. And there are specific protections, and it's a federal law, and there are specific protections for LGBTI inmates and juvenile residents. But we need people to actually implement them. As I tell people, you can have all the laws you want, but human beings have to actually enforce and implement laws. And so there's actually a tremendous amount of work at various jails and prisons throughout the country and it's odd because when I tell people this, they think that's strange, but I think some of the best LGBT policies that I've collaborated with institutions on are actually in jails, prisons, and military brigs. And it's fascinating that the most conservative institutions are sort of leading the way on what might be considered LGBTI inclusion, even though we need to keep people out of those systems. I mean, that should be the first goal, is to put a stop to this mass incarceration. And second, to Holiday's point, not only with trans people, but gender nonconforming people, we see something really interesting going on. As Chinyere said, transgender people are about 0.5% of the population, but 16% of them have been in jail or prison. That's astronomical. About 4% of the adult population is LGB, and about 8.5% of them account for the jail and prison population. And when we look at our youth, about 8% of the general youth population are LGBTQ, and 20% of them account for the detention population. That's 20% of youth in detention, according to Dr. Angela Irvine's latest study, identify as LGBTQ or gender nonconforming. And what's interesting is Dr. Irvine did this study twice, once in 2010 and then again in 2015. And the gender nonconforming numbers doubled from 2010 to 2015. For boys, it was about 5% in 2010, and now it's about 10% of gender nonconforming, with the majority of boys who are gender nonconforming being straight, right? So these are straight boys, but who, because of their mannerisms, they may be more effeminate or what have you. Does everybody know what I mean when I say gender nonconforming? Most people look at me and they think I'm a woman. They may think I'm other things too, but, they would say gender-wise, that's a woman because I wear women's clothing, I have makeup on, and I identify as a woman. So I'm gender conforming. I look like what society says women should look like. But what if I had on a man suit and my hair was really short and I didn't wear makeup and I was more masculine in appearance and mannerisms? I would be gender non-conforming. So we have and with the girls, we've seen it go up to 17% from about 8% in 2010. Now, does that mean more of them are? It could be more of them are disclosing, but a lot of it is you can tell, you can look at somebody most of the time, not all of the time, when you were talking about gender expression, not gender identity, but gender expression. And so there's a clear policing going on of gender expression and gender identity in this country that, and seems to be targeting girls more than it's targeting boys. And that's the same thing around sexual orientation. Of the girls who are in detention in this country who identify as LBQ or gender nonconforming, 40%. 40, that's a 4 and a 0. You heard it. 40%. How is it? How did we get here? So while we were giving all this money to marriage, there was this wholesale locking up of LGBTQ youth and adults that no one was doing anything about. And according to the latest statistics on LGBT funding, about 1% of money goes directly to incarceration efforts. 1%. That's about 1.2 million, right? Now, to put that into perspective, to lock a kid up in a state facility in California for 1 year is about $200,000. That's for one child. Fortunately, most children aren't locked up in state facilities in California. They're in local facilities like most of the adults are. But that just gives you an idea. How can you give $1.2 million to mass incarceration? Mm-hmm. Right? We have 40%. Why are 40% of our girls in detention? 40. I mean, that's astonishing. So
I think that, Bernadette, just to follow up, I think that there's really interesting data starting to emerge about what those push factors are. One of them, we've talked about it a little bit, but kids are getting thrown out of their homes. They don't all look like some of the panelists, but there's an endemic problem of youth homelessness in Detroit, where I did spend some time living. There were 3,000 LGBT children who were living on the streets any given day of the year, because they're being thrown out of their homes. Kids that are not in schools, not accessing those services are more likely to be policed. They're more likely, to be targeted and end up in juvenile facilities and elsewhere. You also have schools that aren't safe, right? You have schools where, again, it's not even implicit bias, it's explicit bias. Teachers are calling students fags. Teachers are, throwing kids out of their classroom because they sashay, because they came to school in a dress, and they're boys or whatever. And so you have a lot of, and so by the way, then they're getting suspended, they're being told to go home, come back in, gender appropriate clothing. These are kids that, are then getting sort of detained, arrested at these increased numbers. And so these are real push factors that, we're not really working to get systematic solutions on. And by the way, there are similar push factors to, to school suspension, school discipline, et cetera, that are affecting Black youth across the country. They're ending up in juvenile detention centers as well.
Remember when I started the introduction and I said that we're talking about really depressing topics? The statistics really reinforce that point. But it's so important that we're having this conversation. Maybe last point before we get to Q&A.
Okay, I'm just a little torn in this conversation because when I hear the statistics, I'm like, oh my God, that's horrifying. It's depressing. Then on the flip side, my brain goes back to it all starts in the home. If we work on strengthening the family unit, if we work on strengthening how we interact and how we teach our children at home, if we equip them to go out into this world, and if a teacher calls them a fag, not to lash out and not to fight or not to do X, Y, and Z, but to come back into the safety nest of your home environment, then I think we'll begin to see a decrease in all of these statistics. Now, that doesn't, mitigate policing and criminalization and all of that, but I think that's where we need to start because that's our foundation. And I think it's not happening. I know it's not happening, and that it's unfortunate. And like I say, it tears me down the middle because I agree with everything that you all are saying, but I don't believe that the tactic or the root of the problem is really being addressed.
It's definitely complicated.
I wish we had more time.
Yeah.
We're going to turn to Q&A now. So as a reminder, if you could please state your name and your affiliation, that'd be really helpful.
Wahoo wah.
Yeah, we're playing each other today. My question is, what compromises should be made in terms of local and national legislation? What compromises, if any, to accommodate homophobia? And I'm asking the question politely, and just as a matter of thinking through it. So with the Civil Rights Act, in order to get it passed, except seniority systems were protected despite their locking in of racial inequality. Small businesses were exempted, private clubs, small rooming houses for sex and national origin religion. There was a BFOQ put in. So even the prototypical civil right that we all sort of use as our example, nonetheless still involved spaces where we said even bigotry has a space that we're going to carve out for it. So what should be done, if anything, in that regard regarding LGBT rights?
Maybe we should do what we did before and collect 3 questions at a time.
Hi, I'm Katie Iyer. I'm from Rutgers Law School. Fantastic panel, really enjoyed it. My question was, I feel like throughout this conference, a real theme across different contexts has been criminalization of various communities and the ways that that is then used as an excuse for violence and discrimination. And thinking about the LGBT rights movement, there are ways that the LGBT rights movement has been extremely successful in the decriminalization project, right, in the sense that it used to be that it was not simply criminal stereotyping, but actual criminal laws that were widely assumed to be justified in terms of LGB as well as T conduct, and in ways it's been really spectacularly unsuccessful, right? As the discussion on this panel here today is talking about, there are lots of folks within the LGBT community who remain very highly policed. So I guess I was just curious to hear if any of you had any thoughts about sort of what are the lessons we can take away from that, and whether this is all about the sort of politics of respectability divide, that some people are going to make it and some people get left behind in that dynamic, or whether there are some more sort of positive lessons we can take from success in, I think, really in meaningful ways shifting the public perception of the sort of inherent criminality of LGBT people.
From UC Berkeley. I would say was the last comment about the family being sort of a bulwark against discrimination in the public space really concerned me, because it seems like, again, a shift to privatization. And I just wonder if maybe the speakers could say more about what the limits of the family are, and maybe how there could be a role for law to play in sort of ensuring safe communities, assuring that there are affirmative rights that individuals can access, and that this all can't be reduced to the level of parents doing more about how they raise their children?
Thank you. So any of those three questions, feel free to respond.
I believe that aside from, neglect or abuse, laws surrounding that, there shouldn't be any laws on how parents should raise their children. So I don't think it's the government's duty to insert themselves into the family unit on that, from that perspective. I think it's the family's duty to equip the child to go out into this world and be successful, be pillars of society, and be strong enough to withstand anything that comes their way. I think we oftentimes want government to play too large a role in our life. And it's kind of like, aren't we adult enough to make our own decisions? I believe so, to make the proper ones. We don't all understand, we don't all agree on what's proper, but we all agree on what's morally acceptable, I would assume, I would hope, but I don't think that that's the government's role to insert themselves in that way.
I can try to bite off Professor Ford Missouri's question as well as the subsequent commentator. I think that one reason why I'm, again, glad that this space is being held to talk about LGBT issues in the broader frame of the civil rights movement is that I think LGBT rights activists in particular need to have a long view of the struggles and not just borrow in terms of flourish and useful analogy from the racial justice-oriented civil rights movement, but to also really understand some of the perils and pitfalls. I do think that incrementalism is a threat to sort of all of our community's survivals, and so that's one reason why I really think that legislation should probably not be a default tool until we're able to advance legislative strategies that don't involve endemic compromise. It's sort of why I'm a courts person. I think at the very least, there's a real danger, a real sort of dignity harm, among others, when you sort of pass through legislation that has compromise. As one recent example is there was a proposal that almost got legs a couple years ago to pass an employment discrimination bill that would have been omnibus as long as you're a sexual minority, not someone who's transgender. So, for instance, it would have protected lesbian, gay, and bisexual employees, but not transgender, gender nonconforming people on the theory that, oh, don't worry, we'll just catch up to you guys later. I don't think it ever works that way. I don't think you want to open up the Civil Rights Act of 1964 multiple times for multiple people's comments and amendments. And so that's not to say that we're not on a crash course with people who are, bearing the bulwark of, religious liberty, although, mind you, those same people think it's okay to close down mosques because of the terrorism, So I just still have some sort of apprehension about sort of pursuing legislation if we can't really get something close to what we need. As far as decriminalization, I think my message to LGBT civil rights activists is, again, to sort of think through the struggles that other communities are facing. I think that the decriminalization effort within the LGBT community has gotten as far as it can without a racial justice lens, right? I mean, what we're not targeting is the systematic, policing of Black and brown bodies, people who are poor, people who look suspicious, who look shifty, and that's different than the right to have, that's different than criminalization of white men's right to sort of have intimate relations in their homes, right? That looks very differently, and I think we're only going to be as successful as people struggling for those same rights when it comes to minorities of other, stripes until we work more closely together.
I'd like to respond first to the family's comment too. I'm not a fan of constantly placing the burden on oppressed peoples to get themselves out of whatever situation. I remember I actually moved here from Oakland, and I remember not going because I refused. I just won't go to protests. And I said this, Duke, we had a rally a couple of weeks ago because there was an anti-LGBT situation that happened, and I'm not oppressing me, so I'm not going to protests. And I really think the people who are in the greater positions of privilege, as Holiday taught, we all have certain levels of privilege. Some of us have a whole lot more than others. And it's your responsibility to figure out amongst yourselves how you need to use that privilege to stop these oppressive institutions. I think that's a phenomenal burden to put on families, especially poor families, families of color. When I mentioned the 20% of LGBT youth who are in detention, 85% of them are youth of color. It's 85%. And I remember talking to a prosecutor, and I said, why is it that in this diversion program, none of these white kids from the suburbs, because this county has more white kids than Black and Latino kids, but the detention center is mostly Black and Latino. And he said, the law enforcement officers don't bring the white kids in. They're doing drugs, they're selling drugs, they're vandalizing stuff, they're stealing cars, and all the research shows this. They're doing all that stuff. But yet their families look a certain way. So then they are appropriate for diversion. Everybody just pull out the stops. We got to keep white kids out of the system. And they said these same police, when they pick up a Black kid in a Black community, the view of that family is different. So that kid does not get the diversion program, even though that child engaged in the exact same behavior that the white child did. The white child doesn't get into the system. That's not a family issue. That's an oppressive, systemic problem.
Do we have time for another round of questions? I think we were told to end at 4, so maybe we could collect. Okay. Maybe 2 more questions. All right.
Thanks so much to the panel. My name's Scott Skinner-Thompson. I'm at NYU. Let's say you are a Black East African Muslim queer who is also HIV positive. Because of social movements, none of those things actually bar your entry into this country anymore. But because you are likely to become a public charge, your entry is barred into this country. Does this hypothetical, which is not a hypothetical, illustrate to you the power of identity-based politics to change our system, or its limitations, or both, and how do we get beyond plain whack-a-mole so that we have a real social justice movement so that all people are treated equally?
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a recent graduate from Duke University, and I currently work in the medical center. And I just wanted to ask Bernadette, or the entire panel in general, but Bernadette brought this up, about like the essential whitewashing and erasure of movements like Stonewall, and how those types of Black and brown bodies are like erased from history and social movements. So if you could give like a brief, just a brief history lesson on, because you said that you would earlier, on the history of that build up to Stonewall, and what are certain resources that could be of use for people who would like to, I guess, educate themselves on those types of historical movements.
we supposed to do those in 2 minutes?
History lesson.
Jonathan, go to the center where you used to always go, and that's where the resources are.
And Scott, I think the hypothetical you provided is just, again, at the risk of sounding Pollyanna, sort of just the critical importance of Dr. King's message still relevant. An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I think that, if anything, the LGBT community has the rare privilege of still sort of being identity-based. You can't get that far as a racial minority in the Supreme Court, at least. There it's colorblind is, somehow derivative of Brown v. Board in the eyes of a couple justices. But I do think that being siloed is definitely the biggest risk to our collective liberties. It's just something that I'm going to continue to say ad nauseum. Certainly, racial justice issues relate to economic justice issues, relate to immigrant justice issues. And again, it's not to say that we're all one and the same, but certainly our movements gain traction when we think about issues together.
Just have a brief response to, I guess, kind of both of those questions and also that MLK quote, because I've always disagreed in justice to certain people is an injustice to everyone. As we see, God bless their souls, the people that lost their lives in France recently, and lots of brown people are losing their lives in the same amount of numbers, more than those numbers all the time, and we don't have those Facebook overhash. And I think that's sort of, so we'll talk about identity politics. We oftentimes only speak of identity politics and even use that term if we're talking about identities that are marginalized. We don't talk about identity politics for centralized identities, but they happen all the time. We generate empathy for certain identities when they're harmed, and we generate policy for certain identities when they're barred from certain rights. So I think that there's a unpacking of identity politics that needs to happen. In terms of interpersonally, I feel like I'm stepping away from them a little bit. Yes and no. I mean, I still definitely work with folks that I most support people who have the identities that I have, but at the same time, and this is probably the last time I'm on the mic, so I want to posit this, which is inclusion, as we're doing advocacy work, is to also include healing work, because there's so many. I always joke that, like, if the revolution were to happen today, and liberation comes tomorrow, I fear that we would treat each other the same ways that we've been fighting against treating, because we don't have any other models except for this privilege and oppression model. Freire talks about this. Y'all, what's the man's name? Thank you. That is sort of my Bible, Torah, Quran, because oftentimes, yes, we can, this is a queer, disabled lesbian, we're going to have them on the panel, but how do you treat your mama? How do you treat your partner? And so a lot of times, yes, we can, raging against the machine, we have identity politics, we align with people that are like us, but that says nothing about who we really are as people. And not to be hokey, but some of our best leaders were awful parents, awful partners. And so I really think we need to start merging like radical healing work with social justice and with advocacy and doing work on ourselves and our families, and while we're also fighting these large systemic oppressions.
All right. I think we're out of time, so thanks again to our amazing panelists.